9 people cut their way out of a tent in the middle of a Russian winter, left behind their boots, and walked into a whiteout to die. They were not beginners. They were experienced cross-country skiers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, 7 men and 2 women, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. On January 23, 1959, they left Sverdlovsk for a difficult winter expedition in the northern Urals. Their route was ambitious but ordinary for them. They carried skis, food, warm clothing, cameras, and the confidence of people who had survived mountains before. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back after a painful nerve injury. It saved his life. The remaining 9 continued toward Mount Otorten, through a region the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakh, the Mountain of Death. Their last known photographs show a normal expedition, smiling faces, heavy packs, a trail through snow. Then, on the evening of February 1st, the group made a decision that would become the center of the mystery. They pitched their tent on an exposed slope instead of descending toward the shelter of the forest. That night, something forced them out. The first search party reached the tent on February 26th. The canvas was partly buried, but the scene inside looked less like a camp abandoned in panic than a meal interrupted. Boots were still there, coats were still there, food sat ready. The tent had been cut open from the inside. The footprints led downhill toward a cedar tree, where rescuers found 2 bodies beside the remains of a small fire. They were dressed in little more than base layers. A few meters away lay 3 more bodies, as if they had tried to climb back toward the tent and collapsed one by one. The final 4 were found months later in a ravine. They had severe blunt force injuries, crushed ribs, a fractured skull, and damage that seemed far too violent for a simple night in the cold. One victim was missing a tongue. 2 were missing their eyes. Some clothing later tested positive for traces of radioactivity. The official Soviet conclusion was famously vague. The hikers died because of an unknown, compelling force that they could not overcome. That sentence did not close the case. It opened a door for decades of theories. So let us rank the main explanations, from the weakest to the one that now has the strongest physical evidence. Number 5. An attack by the Mansi. This theory grew from the location and from old stereotypes. The Mansi knew the mountains, and the hikers had entered a landscape with spiritual significance. Perhaps the group had been attacked, then forced out of the tent, but the evidence is poor. There were no convincing signs of a struggle around the tent, no clear tracks from a group of attackers, and no motive that explains why the victims would flee into a blizzard without their clothes. The theory also turned an indigenous community into a convenient villain because the investigators did not understand the landscape. It ranks last because it requires more missing evidence than present evidence. Number 4. A secret military test. This theory has ingredients that sound made for a thriller. The Soviet Union was testing rockets and weapons. Witnesses in the area reported strange orange lights. Radioactivity appeared on some clothing. The original investigation was closed quickly, and parts of the file remained difficult to access.
But Yuri timing is not proof. Orange lights can be distant launches, flares, or atmospheric effects. The radioactive clothing may have come from earlier work or contamination, not from a deadly beam. Most importantly, a weapons test does not neatly explain the cut tent, the scattered bodies, the footprints, or the way the group moved toward the forest. It explains secrecy better than it explains the deaths. Number 3. Infrasound and the wind. Some researchers have proposed that powerful wind rushing over the mountain produced low-frequency sound. In theory, that could trigger dread, confusion, or a desperate urge to escape. Another version says a violent katabatic wind, a cold current accelerating downhill, made the tent feel unsafe and drove the hikers toward the trees. This is more plausible than a monster or a military ray. Weather clearly mattered. Visibility was poor, the cold was extreme, and wind can turn a familiar route into a maze. But infrasound remains difficult to prove after the fact. It may describe the panic without identifying the first physical event. A wind can explain why people leave. It cannot, by itself, explain the crushing injuries. Number 2. An ordinary avalanche. This was the explanation that Soviet investigators and later Russian prosecutors returned to. A snowslide strikes the tent. The hikers cut their way out because the exit is blocked. Fearing another collapse, they descend toward the forest. In darkness and near whiteout conditions, they cannot find their camp again. They light a fire, lose strength, and freeze. The sequence explains a great deal. It explains the inside cut. It explains why the group left quickly and why they were poorly dressed. It explains the decision to seek the tree line. It explains how hypothermia could kill experienced people who made mostly rational choices in an impossible situation. But the classic avalanche theory had a serious problem. When rescuers arrived weeks later, they saw no obvious avalanche debris. The average slope looked too shallow, and an avalanche seemed unlikely to wait for hours after the tent was built before releasing. Skeptics argued that if a wall of snow had hit the camp, the mountain should have left a clearer signature. Then came the theory ranked number 1, a delayed slab avalanche. In 2021, researchers Johann Gahm and Alexander Puzrin used the terrain, snow physics, historical weather, and computer modeling to test whether a small slab could have released above the tent. Their answer was not that they had solved the mystery. Their answer was narrower and more powerful. The event was physically plausible. The group had cut into the slope to create a flat shelf for the tent. Above them was a local step in the terrain, steeper than the broad slope appeared from a distance. Strong downslope winds could have piled snow onto a buried weak layer. The cut weakened the arrangement. The slab did not have to fall immediately. It could have waited 9 to 13 hours, then cracked under the added weight. That delay matters. It matches the time between the camp being built and the likely moment of death. A small slab could have struck the tent with enough force to crush ribs and skulls without producing a massive avalanche path. It could have buried the canvas, then been dispersed or covered by wind before rescuers arrived 3 weeks later. The mountain did not need to roar like a movie avalanche. It only needed to fail in the wrong place, at the wrong time.
The model also offers a grim explanation for the group's choices. The injured hikers may have been pulled from the tent by their companions. The survivors, fearing a second collapse, moved downhill to the cedar and tried to make a fire. Their tent was still visible in theory, but in a black sky filled with blowing snow, the difference between direction and disorientation disappears. The group split into small decisions: tend the injured, find shelter, keep the fire alive, climb back. No single detail proves this reconstruction. The injuries are unusual. The first investigators left questions unanswered. The missing eyes and tongue sound supernatural, but exposure, animals, and decomposition can alter bodies found months later in a wet ravine. Radioactivity sounds like a secret weapon, but a trace is not a cause of death. And the word avalanche can create a false picture of a towering wall of snow when the proposed event was smaller, delayed, and technically different. That is why the case remains famous, not because every theory is equally strong, but because the evidence is fragmented enough to make certainty feel just out of reach. A secret weapon is cinematic. A Yeti is memorable. Murder has a human face. But the most convincing explanation may be a chain of ordinary failures: a risky camp, wind-loaded snow, a sudden impact, a dark descent, and cold that waited for no one. The Dyatlov Pass hikers did not need to meet an impossible force. They only needed to meet several ordinary forces at once. The final irony is that the mystery began with a sentence meant to end an investigation: an unknown natural force. More than 60 years later, science has not given us a perfect answer. It has given us something less satisfying and more frightening, a version of events that could happen again. If you want more dark true history and science mysteries, subscribe to Twan's History and Science. And remember, sometimes the mountain does not hide a monster.
Sometimes it only hides the evidence.